Today, we're something kind of in the form of a quiz, just to get us thinking. The quiz, it's essentially about testing our knowledge of self. Now, it is geographically, I suppose, mainly around the Caribbean, but it's for everyone of African descent can learn something from this. Now, the question is, why? Now, I kind of got fed up people asking me, what has Africa to do with the Caribbean? I mean, yeah, hundreds of years ago slavery was, so what's the relevance today? I mean, I've said this in a number of videos, and it may have started hundreds of years ago, but let's get it right. It didn't end hundreds of years ago. Africans were still being taken to the Caribbean in the 20th century. But even without that, I suppose the question itself is an example of how blind we have become to who and what we are. Because let's face it, when Europeans invaded the Caribbean, they slaughtered the majority of native peoples, the Native American peoples. Others were killed through diseases introduced to which they had no immunity, and some were taken to be essentially the first slaves working the plantations, to be saved only by the Christian church that wanted to use the Native Americans to expand the whole of the Christian church. So essentially, the Europeans decimated the Native American population of that area. The Europeans themselves didn't particularly like staying in the Caribbean. To them, it was a backwater. They much rather go to North America or South America where, the big cities were and the parties were and the shops were and so on. To a certain extent, being sent to the Caribbean was almost like doing penance kind of thing. You just needed enough people to run the plantations. But over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, Europeans imported millions upon millions upon millions of people from Africa and settled them there to work the plantations. And we remain there. Today, the average Caribbean island is probably around 70 to 90% African in terms of population. Essentially, the Caribbean is like a second Africa. Not only because of the people who populate the area, but also because when they came there, I mean, they didn't arrive there as tourists. They weren't there for a holiday. They weren't there to soak up the local atmosphere and maybe look for a place to settle down. They were brought there through brutality. They were brought there against their will, which meant the only thing that they really brought with them was their identity, their culture, both as a kind of, something to help with their sanity, to understand, to remember who they are and what they are. But also, they discovered that cultural knowledge gave them a tool to work against European imperialism, because fundamentally, in order to make them slaves, Europeans wanted to basically destroy anything African in them and replace that with a European identity. They needed to replace that with the knowledge of a European God so they could use the fear of God to control people. You can't do that if people don't believe in your God. They needed to replace the African sense of identity with the European one. So they would identify with their masters. They would want to be like their master. They would respect their master. So they would be a part of their master's family, if you like. And of course, the masters rule and control their family. And they replaced African values and ideals and cultural products with their own cultural products. So we think and want to be like Europeans. Over the centuries that has worked because we have lost any kind of real understanding of that African culture that we brought with us, that we built into the Caribbean. We don't realise that today so much of Caribbean culture is African. We kind of like say, oh yeah, there's a bit of European, a bit of Spanish, a bit of English, a bit of Dutch kind of thing, but we don't really see the African. I mean, I remember a program some time ago where they were looking at the DNA of African Caribbean people, and they took a sample group and they tested their DNA. And when the results came back, it was what we expected to be in the 80s and the 90s, percentage-wise, of African DNA. But there was one woman who discovered that she had more European DNA than African. Not much more, but enough to make her happy. The happiest person on earth. She was joyous over the fact that she was more European than African. And to a certain extent, that kind of reflects how we see our cultural heritage. So, this quiz is a little bit about, okay, so what is Africa to the Caribbean? What in the Caribbean is African heritage? Now, it's not a difficult one. You could say it's African Heritage 101, basically, simple stuff. So, there's a lot of stuff that you probably will get and will already know about, okay? So, let me go to the questions. Right. Now, what link, other than the people and the culture, is there between the Caribbean and Africa? A clue, it predates our presence there by a long, 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 long time. Okay. Take you back 200 million years or so to that one single continent that occupied our planet, the continent of Pangaea. At that time, the space between what was to be North America and what was to be South America was occupied by that bulge that is West Africa. They were locked together. And around 200 million years ago, when Pangaea started to break apart into the continental plates that we know today, Africa moved away from that region that we now call the Caribbean and spread across. Which means that geologically, Africa and the area they call the Caribbean and areas of South America are almost siblings. They share the same kind of quality of stone, of vegetation and so on. And that's one thing that made Africans priceless when it came to the plantation. They weren't just there as slaves. Yes, of course, they were treated as slaves, but they were important because they understood the land. It's very familiar. Its familiarity to them made it easier for them to be able to say, for example, advise on the growing of crops. But it wasn't just agriculture, medicine as well. Because Europeans, and if you read the works of Francis Bacon, you see how Europeans for centuries, with their scientific thinking, tried to control nature. They believed that they could manage nature, they could do better than nature, and effectively ignored nature. Whereas Africans, of course, grew up with nature. They knew the plants, the land, the animals, and they worked in harmony with them. So they were very capable when it came to managing the plantations and the welfare of the Europeans and their knowledge of natural medicine. You can read the words of Dr. Charles Finch III, talks about the African origins of medicine and those within the Caribbean and how they use their knowledge to heal. So, second question. Just a second. Let's look at religion, a cultural product. Where would you find followers of Shango? Think about it. I can see somebody already. Yes, thank you. You will find followers of Shango in Trinidad. Yes, and yes, you will find followers of Shango in Cuba. Now, I suppose being more specific, where would you find the original followers of Shango, if you like? Where does it originate? Shango, one of the deities of the Orisha. Thank you. Okay, yes, Nigeria, Yoruba. The Yoruba peoples were scattered across the Caribbean, and you will see their culture almost everywhere, but in places like Trinidad and Cuba. Also, yes, you're right, Brazil, even though it's not in the Caribbean, it's still very significant because around half of all Africans taken in slavery ended up in Brazil. When I did my first degree, I did my thesis on the Yoruba, and one of the people I was talking to, they had a friend who was a researcher, and their friend had spent much time in Brazil. Their friend was Yoruba, and he was amazed to find that a small village where he was doing his research, the people there spoke almost pure Yoruba. Now, these are people who had never left their village, never left Brazil. They are the sons and daughters of people who were there before them, whose parents were there before them, whose parents were there before them, and so on, in the same village, yet they spoke almost pure Yoruba. Now, you will find a difference between, say, Shango and the Orisha as worshipped in Trinidad to those in Cuba, to those in Brazil. Why? Because Europeans had this idea that if they mixed and matched African people so they didn't send all one group to one place, they'd find it harder to unite, to work against them. But they were wrong, because on the one hand, of course, Africans are very used to living next door to or amongst people who spoke a different language or practiced a different religion, unlike places, particularly this place in Britain, this little island kind of thing, isolated from everywhere else, believing that everyone in the world should speak English. They were used to it, so it wasn't an issue. But Europeans made it even less of an issue, because what they did was gave them a common enemy. Africans knew to fight European imperialism. Okay, and that brought Africans together. So instead of being Yoruba or Santi or Fon or whatever, they just identified as Africans. But because of that mixing, you will find a different mix of African groups in Trinidad as you will in Cuba, as you will in Brazil. So even those dominated, and certain groups did dominate areas, like the Yoruba did, there'd be elements of other cultures mixed in there. And as I said, that would be different in different parts of the island. So it's still fundamentally that, i.e. Shango, but with slight differences. Where would you find Anansi? Yes, of course. The obvious one. Jamaica, Anansi folktales, the Jamaican hero. But didn't originate in Jamaica. Yes, I know. Yes, you'd also find them in some of the ex-Dutch territories, Curacao, Bonaire, Aruba, and so on. But again, didn't originate there. To a certain extent, the clue is in the name Anansi, which means spider, but in which language? Right, okay, thank you. Yes. Anansi originated in Ghana, with the Akan speaking, the Ashanti people, who again, whose culture dominates Jamaica's culture, Jamaica's history, the thing. One of their gods, the spider god. What about the Vodum? Where would you find the Vodum? Yes, okay, yes, very similarity, and it is essentially the same. Vodum, voodoo spelt differently depending on which part of the world you practice it. And yes, Haiti, on the island of Hispaniola, which is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, you will find voodoo. Southern states of America, Louisiana, you will find the voodoo. The Vodum is the pantheon of gods for which people? Thank you. Yes. The Fon people of Benin, that is the current name of the country, but historically it was Dahomey. Now, there are Fon scattered across West Africa, the bulk we know to be in Dahomey, but because of the Europeans coming along and saying, yeah, I'll draw a line here and draw a line there, we can have that bit, you can have that bit. The Fon is one of those people in Africa who found themselves really cut to ribbons, as it were, cut up into different countries. But we can identify Vodum, Papa Legba, with the Fon people of Dahomey, brought to the Caribbean. Now, one of the reasons why it's difficult for us to identify these, and you'll often hear things say, oh yeah, this is synchronous religion with bits of Christianity or whatever mixed in kind of thing. No, it wasn't mixed in. Africans were not allowed to practice their religions. You could face corporal or even capital punishment for practicing an African faith. Now, this exposed European hypocrisy, because Europeans accused Africans of doing something heinous, worshipping more than one God. How could you? There is only one God, they were told. So the Africans were a bit confused. It's like, okay, you say there is only one God, but who's that person that you're worshipping? And that person that you're worshipping? And that person that you're worshipping? Now, to the Europeans, they call them saints. But they worshipped them in very similar way as to say the Africans worship their deities. But the Europeans said that they only had one God. Their whole religion is named after somebody called Christ. Now, who's Christ? Was he God? So why do they worship this Christ if he wasn't the God? Holy Mother, Mary, Mary, Mother of God. She was the mother of Jesus Christ. So was Jesus Christ God? Now, the Europeans have their Holy Trinity thing, which, three different things which are the one thing and so on. But from the outside, you wouldn't understand that. Any more than the Europeans understood the way in which Africans worship their deities, because their deities seem to reflect very much similar to what the Europeans call saints. Thousands and thousands of saints. Saint for this and saint for that, and for this different practice and for that different practice, and for journeying and all sorts. Whereas the Africans had deities for similar things. So what they did was they took the names of those European deities, those European saints, and like Jesus Christ and so, and applied them to their African deities. So from the outside, it looked like they were practicing Christianity, but of course they weren't. Now, over the years, we've kind of lost that original connection, particularly by those, I say black people rather than Africans, because black people are those who are basically lost their cultural identity and just become an object, identified by the colour of their skin, a little more. Become very Europeanized, so from black people to black British people, who only really see the Christian element of it, but are happy to identify the fact that the religions worshipped predominantly by black people, African, if you like, versions of Christianity, are very different from the way in which Europeans, white Europeans particularly, practice Christianity. Why? Because of that African heritage. And there's a whole list here of religions within the Caribbean which owe their origin to Africa. Mael, Obia, Revival, particularly Pocomania element of it, Santeria, Palo, Kumina. Kumina is an interesting one because, it's a practice that, well, I'll come into that later on actually. I think I'll mention that. Dugu, Kete, the Orisha, of course, is one of the fastest growing languages for African people in the diaspora, picking up on the gods of the Orisha. Food. Who eats ackee? Or who likes ackee? Or where is ackee famous? Yes, again. Jamaica, of course, it's its national dish. Ackee and saltfish. Where else can you find that? And you've got to be careful with ackee because there are other islands in the Caribbean who talk about ackee, but essentially theirs is like a sweet fruit, a very different one from the one that we know, everyone knows in Jamaica, the savoury fruit. So that's what I'm talking about. Where would you find the origins of that? Yes, thank you. Again, the Asante people, Ghana. Now, people say that people in Africa don't eat ackee. Yes, it's not as popular. It's definitely not as revered. But there are people outside of Jamaica who eat ackee. And ackee can be found in more countries than just Ghana, but of course it's the Asante people from Ghana who brought that to the Caribbean. So Jamaicans owe their national dish to their African heritage. But here, there's a whole list of other foodstuffs in the Caribbean that we have that come from Africa. Yam, pepper pot, callaloo, gunga peas or pigeon peas as some would call them, plantain, accra, predominantly fish ones, because the source of it, Yoruba again, akara, which can be made of peas and different things, but in the Caribbean we kind of know it mainly to be made of saltfish. Of course, ackee I've mentioned, taro, breadfruit, mangoes, interesting because of course they originate in Asia, but Europeans brought them to Africa, particularly the Portuguese, and then from there to the Americas and the Caribbean. And then there's things like, for example, we have jambalaya. Now, the Europeans will say that this is more closely to the sort of like the Spanish dish of paella. But of course, we know it as being very close to jollof rice from Nigeria. And then the famous rice and peas that we have in the Caribbean, not the ones with green garden peas, but yes, the other form of rice and peas, which is very close to wache, which is a Ghanaian dish again. And of course, gumbo, Southern America, comes from the Angolan word ngombo, ki ngombo, which means accra. And of course, we know classic gumbo is made with okra. And the islands. I mentioned before about having that particular connection kind of thing about the DNA. Now, we know that African Caribbean people are still roughly in the 90s when it comes to the percentage of African DNA. But certain islands, I mentioned, are dominated by certain cultural groups, even though they may have a mix of other cultural groups. So you can almost trace most of what happens on that island culturally back to a particular group within Africa. I'm just going to mention a few here. So what about Jamaica? And you should know this from the previous answers. Where we connect? Yes, of course. Ghana. So much of Jamaican culture, music, language, food, etc. originated in Ghana. The strong historical cultural connection there. Trinidad. Yep, you remember, of course, Yoruba. And even though they may not dominate all islands, you will find bits of Yoruba culture all across the Caribbean area, and of course South America, not just the islands themselves, because of course, as we know, many millions of Africans were shipped across South America. Now, I have a friend, or knew of a friend, who went to get their DNA tested, and they were quite surprised to find out that their DNA suggested that they had a strong Nigerian heritage. Now, surprised because they didn't really know anyone in their family who was Nigerian. They'd never been there. I don't know. They don't even really know many Nigerians. So why? Until he said, okay, aren't you from Trinidad? Or Trinidadian heritage? Yes. Well, there you are. If you're from Trinidad, the chances are you will have some Nigerian heritage in you, just as if you're from Jamaica, you will have some Ghanaian heritage in you. And of course, if you were in Haiti, you will have elements of Fon heritage in you. And it's kind of that thing, just give me a second here, kind of that thing which connects us, and I mentioned before about the culture. So physically, genetically, we're connected. The land is connected, but also the culture. And I'm talking more about the cultural products. This is where we get confused and people think religion, food, all those things are our culture. No, they're not. They are products of our culture. It's our culture that shapes them. and makes them say different from religion, food, music, and so from other parts of the world. And it's quite distinctive in the Caribbean. We have strong aspects about like our music, which is built around rhythm and structure. That doesn't come from Europe. European music is built around melody and harmony, the tune, which is why you'd find North American forms of so-called black music tend to be dominated by melody and harmony within a European context and appearing to European needs. But in the Caribbean, where you don't have that strong European context or strong European presence, you will find music which is more built around those African elements, that is rhythm and the use of rhythm. And when I say rhythm, I mean rhythm, not beats, like a single beat. A single beat to rhythm is like, I don't know, an egg sandwiches to a three-course meal. It's all food, but somebody who's used to three-course meals isn't going to be satisfied with an egg sandwich. So, I mentioned before Kumina and Cromanti, Jamaica, very much Asante again. But what about Kumina? Yes, you're right. Kumina is also in Jamaica. The roots of many forms of modern cultural practice in Jamaica, particularly things like, say, reggae music. No, not the Asante, but from Angola, further south, but still on the west coast, from where a lot of Africans were taken as slaves. In fact, I remember some years ago, well, a long time ago now, they took some Kumina plays from Jamaica to Angola, and they were surprised at how people understood, how quickly people understood what they were about, the language and so on. We have no reference to know. This just sounds like weird country talk in the Caribbean, but it's not. Just like people say that we speak, I don't know, that we speak a dialect of English, patois they call it, which essentially patois is simply a French word for dialect. It's not a dialect of English. It's more associated with our African heritage and African languages, but of course English vocabulary or French vocabulary or Dutch vocabulary, because we had to appear to be speaking the European language. Otherwise we'd be in trouble. But structurally, in terms of grammar and context and so on, identifies more with West Africa than it does with Europe. So you could almost see it as a different language. The guy Morgan Delphinis wrote a hell of a lot about this. And then there are others. In our culture we have Bele, Dominica, Yam, Jonkunu, again from Ghana, Mokojombi, again sort of like a mix from West Africa, particularly in the Yoruba sort of thing. There are so many things in the Caribbean that we celebrate that originated in Africa, but we don't see it as that. We just think of it as, I don't know, as Jamaican or Trinidadian or whatever. We grew up with it. And that's there today. It's not hundreds of years ago. It's there today. But because we isolate ourselves and because we were educated to hate everything African about ourselves, we don't see it. Okay, so that's the bulk of the questions. This is moving a little away from the Caribbean now, because we mustn't forget that the Caribbean wasn't the only area dominated by Europeans where we were encouraged to reject our African heritage. Europeans did this on Africa itself. Can you imagine that? On the home of African people, encouraging those people to reject their heritage, to believe in themselves as being European. But it happened, and there were plantations as well of the African continent. So we see there a history where we were grown up, or brought up, if you like, as Europeans. When it comes to religion, yeah, we dominate the Christian church. We accept Christianity over indigenous religions that have been with us for thousands and thousands of years. The home of those religions that have shaped, if you like, our continent. We will reject and call them, I don't know, witchcraft, evil. I'm not sure. If you took all the various world religions and compared them to see which was most evil. But anyway, yes. But particularly since, the late 20th century, when we had the wars for independence and Africans reclaimed their heritage. We found a number of countries identifying their history, their past, and celebrating that in their name. So the last few questions now be, where was Ghana? No, not where is Ghana, where was Ghana? Thank you. Yes, further to the north, roughly around where Mali and Mauritania are today. But Mali itself was a great civilization. In fact, it took over from Ghana, built up on what the ancient Ghanaians had done in terms of building a civilization which wasn't really built on war and slaughter in masses, but on collaboration. And Mali became one of the wealthiest civilizations on earth, and one of its leaders, the Mansa Musa, still today is regarded as the wealthiest person in history. But in spite of its wealth from things like salt and gold and the trans-Saharan trade routes, there's one thing prized. According to historian Basil Davidson, there's one thing prized by Mali civilization above all of that, and that was books. The great university at Timbuktu is one of the oldest universities in the world. People travelled from across the continent, from across the world even, to visit the libraries. Where was Zimbabwe? It should be slightly easy because, yeah, you're right. The answer is Zimbabwe was in Zimbabwe. So modern day Zimbabwe recognised its ancient history and what was named Great Zimbabwe, that great city, which is probably around southeastern region of modern day Zimbabwe. But at the time when that country was Rhodesia, under similar apartheid rules to South Africa, the world wasn't allowed to know that Zimbabwe was developed by Africans. The ruins were there, and archaeologists were there to research those ruins. But according to the journalist Julie Fredrickson, she wrote a book called None But Ourselves. Now, in that book, she kind of documents what was going on at that time. In Rhodesia, and she had an interview with one of the archaeologists examining Great Zimbabwe, and he said that they have never been so suppressed. They've never had knowledge so suppressed since the time of Adolf Hitler. They were not allowed to say or even suggest that Great Zimbabwe was built by black Africans. They could say anyone else, Asian, Arabic, Europeans, but not black Africans. And this was a dictate coming down from the government. They didn't want the world to know their lies about primitive, underdeveloped continent that they needed to occupy in order to bring it into the modern world. Zimbabwe was a city with huge walls about 11 meters high, 6 meters wide, made of granite stone. Not with mortar. So anybody who's ever done dry stone walling knows how difficult it is to shape those stones so they weld together effectively. They come together exactly to make those walls stand for hundreds of years. And the thing about Zimbabwe was that not only was it large, I think they estimate around 18 to 20,000 people could have occupied there. The population was more around the 10, 12,000 people, that sort of thing. So there was space there. But the more important thing is they had an arts community. They had artists. They produced art. And according to Europeans themselves, when a society produces art, it can be deemed to be civilized, an advanced civilization. So, of course, all of that exposes the European lies about Africa, that there were no civilizations, let alone advanced civilizations, in Africa. Final one here. What about Benin? And I mentioned Benin before, what used to be called Dahomey, but not the ancient Benin, if you like. Benin City particularly. Where is that today? Well, Benin is still found today in eastern Nigeria. Now, the thing about Benin was, again, it was a great city. Europeans visited there long before they invaded the continent and tried to colonize the entire continent. But no, they visited there, which again exposed their lies because Europeans knew how civilized Africa was before they invaded. Visitors from places like Holland came there, and they commented that some of the architecture, the grand architecture in the Benin city, was on a par with that they had in Amsterdam at the time. They talked about the walls in Benin city, protecting the city, which they said measured, when you measure them end to end, longer than the Great Wall of China. And of course, street lighting was another thing that they had there. And they said that it's probably the safest place they've ever felt to live in, where you didn't have to worry about criminality and so on. What we tend to know Benin culture for is, again, the artworks, the sculptures. Europeans refused to believe that those sculptures could be made by Africans. They're so used to the kind of sculptures that Pablo Picasso celebrated, like the Dogon and so on, and lots of African cultures. But these were naturalistic. These looked like real people, if you like. They'd sculpted the faces and the features in bronze. And they didn't believe that Africans had that technology. I mean, metalworking technology had existed in Africa 1,000 years before it came to Europe. And as with Zimbabwe, going back to Zimbabwe, when Great Zimbabwe was built with its huge stone walls, in Britain, castles were Motte and Bailey. So there was a huge earth mound with wooden fencing around it and wooden buildings. So in many areas of Africa, we were miles ahead of European, and they didn't want to accept that. They didn't want to admit that because, again, it would expose their lies. So, one final thing now, it's not really a city, but it's still, I think, relevant in terms of how we fight for our African identity, and that is Azania. Now, I say it's different because it's not like there is a country called Azania today, but there nearly was. And what country was nearly called Azania? Yes, thank you. South Africa. During apartheid, organisations fighting for the liberation of South Africa wanted to rename it Azania. Now, Azania itself, we don't know a great deal about that civilization. It's said by some to have stretched from Somalia up in the north on the eastern coast down to South Africa. Different reports will give a different size. Again, it was renowned for its trade and its civilization. People, it was very well known to the Romans and so on, but our knowledge of it has faded. But the South African organisations, black organisations, wanted to call it Azania. They went by Azania. You had the Pan-African Congress of Azania. You had the Azanian National People's Party, a number of organisations. But of course that didn't happen because the Europeans backed their friend. The organisation they knew would support Britain and America post-apartheid. Because apartheid had to go. They knew it had to go. They could no longer sustain a system of apartheid, particularly the way the rest of the African continent had gone, where Europeans had lost their colonies. Apartheid, even if you did nothing, apartheid would go. But they knew it would go, so they wanted to secure their position post-apartheid. So they backed an organisation and helped that organisation gain power, the ANC. Nelson Mandela was said to have spent 27 years in incarceration. He spent a lot of those 27 years in diplomatic meetings, in conferences. The final few years were spent in a villa with a swimming pool and so on. He came out after 27 years in incarceration looking younger and fresher than most 27-year-olds brought up in the townships. Steve Biko didn't even get to go to that prison. He was killed before then. So yes, They made sure they secured their treasures. The people who post-apartheid would guarantee their position. I remember back in the 80s going to meetings and everybody celebrating because there was a particular meeting where the ANC were going to share the platform with other organisations. And I remember, I think it was a Pan-African Congress, Zania. I think the Azanian National People's Party was there and the Black Consciousness Party. I think it was a long time ago, this. But the main thing was everybody was excited because the ANC would normally never get involved with an event with these other organisations. It didn't want to be a part of that. But there they were. They were on the bill. But the problem was, when we got there, instead of them sharing one platform, the venue had to separate into two separate rooms. So in one, you had organisations like the Pan-African Congress, the National People's Party. In another, you had the ANC. They refused to be on the same stage. And they weren't, well, to me, they weren't senior members of the ANC. And it was almost like questioning a politician on something that they find very difficult. You kind of got the stock answers. So, you know, that's why we have today where what could have been Azania was decided, no, it's going to remain South Africa, I think. So that try to recognise, identify with their African past remained with what was essentially kind of like a Eurocentric identity that remained. And that's much it, I think, because it kind of states where we are. We don't know our heritage, we're blind to it, and we very often run away from it because it's something strange to what we know, the European existence, and it can cause problems. You know, we'd rather be British or American or French or Spanish or Dutch than African, which is why we end up fighting in these little, I don't know, isolated groups. And you even have the situation where British blacks can't identify with American blacks. People saying we want Black History Month different in this country because we can't identify with the political struggles in America. It's almost like it's a different breed, a different species. Never experienced racism. They've never experienced, they have no history of slavery or colonialism kind of thing, don't they? And of course we don't get anywhere because we are fighting in solitary groups, more fixated on becoming accepted in European society than understanding truly who we are and that connection that we are. Maybe we should learn from our history, where Fon and Asante and Yoruba and other Bantu-speaking peoples got together and worked together, identify themselves at one common denominator, that they were African. And in the same on the African continent, where Africans from across the continent helped and supported each other. Kwame Nkrumah sent troops marching all the way down through to areas like the Congo and that sort of thing to support them in their struggles. Universities in Tanzania with people from the Caribbean like Walter Rodney teaching people revolutionary studies. People from the Caribbean, even from this country, and so going across to Africa to help out, to make that struggle real. We've kind of lost that. About the only people who didn't centrally get involved were those in North America because they were far too busy fighting to sit on the front of a bus or to go to a white school and so on, and didn't really get involved in the African struggles. In fact, you had people in North America who were working with the government to suppress the African liberation struggles. I've mentioned that already in one of my videos, so it's worthwhile looking that up if you're not sure. But anyway, overall, I think we did well. We had some good responses. Like I said, it's quite basic, but it's a start, and encouraging people to find out a lot more about themselves and who they are, particularly who they were before slavery, because that's important. That's almost like a kind of metric. What were we like? What should we have been? Doesn't mean to say that we can relive that and we can repeat that. No, but it gives us an idea of what has changed and why that's changed and what we might need to do to correct that. So, thank you.